The food service, hospitality, and retail industries are evolving in ways you've never heard of until now. Hosted by global industry technovator Rob Grimes and powered by the IFBTA, Techbytes is your go-to podcast, putting technology innovation and trends on the menu.
Rob Grimes with Techbytes and, of course, the IFBTA. And we're having another one of those tech conversations in the food service industry from the floor of the National Restaurant Show. But who else would you want to have a conversation with than the National Restaurant Association itself? So I'm really pleased to have that conversation today. First of all, with two old friends, not so old, but good friends, let's say it that way. And it's a great subject of technology. So first of all, Hudson Riehle, who is the Senior Vice President for Research and Knowledge Group. That's interesting. And then also Kevin Steele, who's the Chief Information Officer of the National Restaurant Association. So welcome to Techbytes. So I think to just sort of kick this thing off, when we think about research and we think about things that are going on in the industry, earlier this year, I had the opportunity actually to quote a research project that you did, Hudson, and where technology really stands in here. And I suspect it's probably changed even by the size of the area that we're sitting in right now. So could you give us some sort of highlights of where you see the industry right now as technology sits in it and the use?
When you look at technology integration in the industry, the pandemic obviously accelerated the adaptation and investment. Association research shows that operators, by and large, have stepped up their resource allocation to technology in four primary areas. And if you think about the industry labor situation, employing 15.7 million individuals, the sales per employee essentially are just $83,000 a year. So with the labor intensity of the United States restaurant industry the way it is currently, when technology is applied against it, you can really get some efficiency and productivity gains.
But when you're talking about people making an investment, because I get this question all the time, and Kevin, you might actually get this question as well. People are always asking how much of their revenue, or is there some magic percentage that they ought to be putting forward for technology? And by the way, before you answer that, I always say to them, well, how do you define technology? Because there's a lot of things they don't throw in. So is there something that's a discussion point of how somebody should invest?
I said from a practitioner perspective, I think investment is based on where you think you're going to get the best value. And to your point, technology is a hard thing to pinpoint from that perspective. So when you think about customer-facing capabilities and features that you want to put in front of your customer to make their experience better, or you think about efficiencies in the back office or in the back of house, that's where you want to determine what the ROI is going to be based on that investment versus saying, well, I'm just going to apply, 10% of my revenue to technology because it's going to be hard.
But I suppose that answer is different whether you're talking about independent restaurants or you're talking about small to medium businesses, whether you're talking about specific markets. So I'm guessing that the research here is going to tell me this, right? But specific market segments or the enterprise customers in how they view technology in their spend. Is there some differences that you see, Hudson, in that area?
Well, I mean, what you're talking about essentially boils down to an accounting question. It's no different than when you ask an organization what they spend on training, for example. And it's whether it's actually expensed, whether it's capitalized, what's included, are the actual labor costs included? And so you get a wide range when you ask that question.
Are you an accountant by trade?
Well, we produce the Restaurant Industry Operations Report, which is, in essence, an accounting analysis of income statements. So,
but doesn't it get confused today when you look at so many systems that are being purchased as, software as a service, hardware as a service? Absolutely. I mean, how do you account for that? Because what's really happening, if you look at CapEx and you look at operating expense, it's really changed the model of how somebody would actually even count the purchase or where it fits.
Absolutely. And to Hudson's point, I think even the accounting rules are changing in terms of how you capitalize those types of expenses. Historically, it's been if it's a hard asset, you can capitalize it. If there's labor involved in building a new feature, you can capitalize, right? I think now we're moving more towards some of these services that you can purchase, SaaS capabilities.
Some of it's also because the financial institutions are buying the point of sale companies in
Yes.
there. I mean, you look at that consolidation in there, so everybody believes that there's a model there that may not, in fact, be based on. So it's interesting, Hudson. You mentioned the spend per employee, right? And retail looks at the cost per foot, right? And we look at a check average or something. Well, I find it fascinating when I talk to these technology companies here. Some of them are looking at credit card transactions to measure whether somebody is an independent, small to medium, or enterprise, while other people look at number of units. And if you're in the labor side, which we definitely need to talk about, they're looking at number of employees. I don't know how you count this.
But I don't think that's unexpected because the restaurant industry is an extremely fragmented industry. There's 70 distinct segments, and then you do it operationally across quick service, table service, delivery. So there are a lot of, in essence, individualized technology solutions that can't be universally applied.
So I never would have thought of 70 segments, by the way. So we're going to have a sidebar on that because I want to make sure that we're looking at the 70 segments even as the IFPTA, right?
Right.
Because I'm not sure how many I would count, but I can tell you it's not 70.
Right.
So I'd like to figure that out. And by the way, can we just clarify that? Is that 70 segments internationally where you throw in like pubs and things different from bars? Or is it 70 segments in, let's say, North America?
Well, there's commercial food service, of which...
Well, of course.
Right.
Yeah.
Then there's institutional, and then there's military. So those three are wrapped up into the $1.1 trillion.
So there's a lot.
Right. I mean, in essence, if you think about it, there's food service in prisons, in sports centers. I mean, there's a whole...
So I usually lump those into, on-site segment, and I look at like stadiums and arenas. I look colleges and universities, business food service, and then, the non-traditional. So I'd have 4, but it sounds like you take my 4 and you make it like 12 because the segment prisons are obviously...
Yeah, I mean, when you look at the industry, about 70% of sales are what people think of as traditional restaurants. In other words, eating and drinking places.
So let me ask you this. So Kevin, you manage not only the technology within the association itself, but you also manage, do we still call them study groups?
Expert exchanges.
Expert exchanges, very good. I actually do know that from the website, so I should have known that one. My apologies on it. But you manage the expert exchanges, of which IT, is one of those.
One of them,
but so is marketing, by the way, and those two, and so is the accounting, right? So those groups actually intersect. So we recognize that, right?
Correct.
But when you're viewing it from the industry point of view, let's forget about the 70 segments for a second here. When you're looking at the industry point of view, is there some commonality of what they all need in tech and what the main themes are today in ops?
Yeah, some of the general themes, front of house, back of house, right? And some of the capabilities you put in front of your customers versus efficiencies in the back. Data is a big one. Cybersecurity is another big topic that everyone is kind of comment on.
Do they care about it or do they comment on it?
They care about it.
Do they care about it if they're a franchisee versus a franchisor?
They do in terms of how you apply it. The general theme of the concern of the topic is where we kind of create this commonality across those different groups.
Okay.
To Hudson's point, there's a lot of disparity in a mom and pop operator sitting down that runs their technology compared to White Castle and the head of technology from White Castle. They both care about cybersecurity, but the way you apply it becomes differentiating based on their size and the amount of resource they can deploy.
But do you think that people don't realize how important the technology and the data security are to them because they're connected to so many systems? I even think about the mom and pop, and if they're taking reservations or they're doing online. To your point, Hudson, COVID brought us the online ordering and delivery with people that never thought about doing that. A lot of those were the independents, right? And their systems might not have helped them. So, do you think that they've changed their focus and they realize how important this is, or do you think they just expect it to be delivered to them by either the technology provider or protected by the association?
I think it's more the provider. And I think it happens in two ways, right? One of which is you're buying a service, you expect that provider to be an expert on a number of topics
And
related
they
to how
always
they're
get the
providing
blame,
this.
by the way, when something gets breached, right?
Absolutely, absolutely. But the second part of it is how does the operator educate themselves in terms of what they need to understand about what they are purchasing from that provider, and be able to challenge those providers relative to, making sure they're keeping their data safe and understanding the privacy laws within different states, especially if you're operating in different states.
So,
as an example.
oh boy, so you open up the states in this conversation, and of course, you have the Council on the State Restaurants, and you have the groups there. I mean, that in itself is a national association. And by the way, I recognize that you actually do global things as well. You lead the way in those. But how do you actually keep track? And who is responsible for keeping track and helping to make sure those things are protected at the state level versus the interests of the enterprise and the multi-states? I mean, what a complex situation. 70 times I don't know what.
It's difficult. I don't know, Hudson, if some of the research has bared out on that.
I think if you look at technology and compare it historically to the development of the food and beverage supply chain, I think it's a good analogy because technology in our industry is still very young.
And the supply chain is not definitely connected either.
Right.
It's not necessarily connected.
And so if you think about, and we've surveyed restaurant operators on this, very few of them consider themselves leading edge technology. Most of them think they do best to be mainstream, and a fairly large portion consider themselves to be laggards. So what's happened now as a catalyst, in addition to COVID, is labor supply. When you survey restaurant operators, their top challenge is labor recruitment. So how do you solve that when there are 1 million job vacancies and it's actually limiting their growth? Well, one answer to that is technology. And if you look at some of the leading edge apps now for the just-in-time, what we call economy, there's just-in-time employment developing.
Well, the gig.
Right. And there are a couple advantages to that because it allows the flexibility for the owner to staff according to what their demand is.
But you know what? So first of all, you're throwing out so many different subjects here. That we could spend an hour on each one,
Absolutely.
right? If we talk about labor and we talk about the gig economy there's another side of it, which is the certification and people actually understanding what they need to do in their job. Now, obviously, the association has ServSafe out there that is doing that portion in it. There could be a discussion to be had about technology certification at some point here.
Absolutely,
Okay, I get
yes,
that.
yes.
We have ProStart, which is going ahead and bringing in people that are looking to do the industry, right? But, how do you actually educate and bring that information to those who really need it with such a diverse group? And I'm going to add one layer onto this. The food service industry, I don't even know how to define it. Hudson, you did a great job there. Yeah. But where do we talk about the convergence with C-stores? We're putting restaurants in C-stores. We got them in Walmarts. We got micro markets sitting in an airport. And in hotels, we have vending machines doing pizza. So how do you do that? I mean, how do you do that as an association?
We have a definition. All meals, snacks prepared away from home, including all off premises. We actually, in that 1.1 trillion, include C-store food service sales as well as grocery store food service sales. In other words, those freshly prepared items versus the shelf-stable retail.
By the way,
sales.
I appreciate the fact that you just said freshly prepared.
Right.
Because I've been looking at the vending machine industry, and to say fresh food is a different definition than freshly prepared. And when you take a look at, so I include in technology, food technology and cooking. So if you include sous vide cooking in there, which can be held for 2 years, and you look at somebody like Taffer's Tavern or somebody like that, or the whole institutional segment, it's freshly prepared. It tastes like it's fresh, but it might not actually be there. Right. And it carries, it really carries forward. So Kevin, you and I have gotten together for some meals with your counterparts at the Hotel Association. I'm sure you know the retail guys.
Yep.
So how do you compare notes and actually trade information between those other groups and other industries, because it's not all invented here, yet you lead the way in food service operations, and yet those industries have it as well.
Yeah. Well, again, it gets back to what are the biggest pain points that we all kind of commonly experience. Even from an association perspective, what we do is training and certification. I'm not an operator. I don't deploy technologies in a kitchen operation or in a front of house operation. But we do have cybersecurity concerns. We do have data concerns that we focus on as well. So when you look at those common threads, that's where a lot of different industries, a lot of different points of presence to a customer can start to understand and talk about, how do you deal with, a given situation relative to ransomware as a cybersecurity.
Do you ever get
topic.
together with your peers in the other associations to actually either have that conversation or bring together the operator? I mean, we do that. I mean, with the other groups, get the operators together to share information.
We do, absolutely. We through various different. Sometimes the vendors will bring groups together. We have ASAE, as you know, that does a great job of bringing together practitioners across the association space. Me as CIO, I look for a lot of different venues where I can get together with practitioners, whether it's like practitioners relative to associations or other CIOs that run completely different operations. And you can always learn something from the different experiences and the challenges that they're facing.
With the rapid expansion of technology in the food and beverage industries, finding the right supplier can become overwhelming and complicated. To simplify this process, the IFBTA created Exchange. Exchange is a powerful search tool where users can easily narrow down their technology search and refine results by application type, geography served, department, and more. Browse resources and learn more about the industry's technology suppliers at exchange.ifbta.org. Now, back to the show.
Yeah, I mean, we're not insular. It used to be that people would just look within their industry silo, and today our industries really cross over. Even the IFA, because I look at associations and I'll sit there and say there are vertical associations and there are horizontal ones.
Yep.
IFBTA is horizontal. IFA, chart, are all horizontal. They represent different constituencies within what we do. But yet, if we're really talking about food service operators, it's really the Restaurant Association that's bringing that together across the board, no matter where it is. Let's change subjects a little bit because we are sitting in the tech pavilion here and we're having a tech conversation here. So I'm going to guess that you each might have a different thought on this. So Hudson, you got here, you haven't walked the whole thing yet, but I'm going to guess with a title of research and knowledge, you probably did some research before you were coming here, or you had expectations. So we can compare notes after the show. But what did you expect to see would be the technology themes here at the show?
Well, I've been coming for so long, I remember when there wasn't even a tech pavilion.
Oh, I do too.
Right. So I can remember.
And by the way, they put it in the back of the room,
Right.
I might point out, but now it goes to the front.
Right. So, I think that's very representative of the focus and importance to it now. And you bring up a good point earlier about what business are you actually in? And so, if you look at quick service and how it will evolve over the next 10 to 20 years, that convenience aspect, because technology is a convenience facilitator, is only going to get more investment and continue to grow. So what makes people choose to use restaurants? Well, convenience and socialization. And convenience now is 74% of all restaurant traffic.
But do we also look at the expanding revenue centers within restaurants? Because certainly delivery opened up one. Curbside's an interesting one when I see these hot and cold lockers that go into a 7-Eleven, so that's like halfway there. But also you get people, like Wow Bao is here, they're going CPG and putting things on the grocery shelves. So where does a restaurant or a food service operator actually start and finish?
Well, it's interesting. In the report we just released, we carve out delivery as an entirely different operational component of technology.
Are people putting that in their revenue centers as they now look at the tech and the data on it?
Yeah, I mean, if you look at the consumer and how they use convenience in the restaurant industry, they expect the least amount of technology in full service. The second is quick service. Obviously, they're much more accepting of technology in quick service. And then the delivery occasion, even the boomers want to see technology and use technology in delivery.
Okay, so Kevin, I'm going to put you on the spot
Sure.
because I'm not going to say anything here.
But
Very uncharacteristic, but I'm not going to do that. So, you heard what Hudson just had to say about the amount of technology from full service down to QSR. Do you have the same perspective in that?
Yeah, absolutely. And what boggles my mind when we talk about the tech pavilion, quote unquote, here, there's a focus on technology very specifically as it relates to applying things like POS and labor management, those types of
The
things.
operation technology.
Right. But the pervasiveness of technology across all of the different capabilities you deploy in the restaurant is amazing to me. Robotics is another area that, while it doesn't look and feel like something you can touch, like a POS, the efficiency that it brings to the operation.
Yeah, but in past years, there's a much bigger robotics presence than there is this year. That's sort of interesting to me.
Yeah, I think it's one of those things where it will come and go in terms of, where you can deploy it. It's an expensive capital investment, as we talked
Right.
about that earlier, right? So that sometimes becomes a little challenging. But I think my point is the way you're seeing technology utilized, AI is another thing, right? That is starting to become a lot more pervasive through other means of serving a restaurant or serving your customer versus something that's, again, right in front of your face, like a kiosk or some other means of deploying technology.
if I was a technology provider to the industry, I would be very careful and specific about my lexicon in terms of how I market my services.
Okay.
Because when you survey consumers about the use of robots in the industry, it has somewhat of a negative connotation. If you couch it differently about automation systems, those that they see and they can't see, they will agree with a lot of it. So I think in terms of if you're trying to sell services, particularly to smaller operators, it has to be couched in a non-robotic
Well,
lexicon.
and it has to be couched in a way that's non-threatening and that it's something intuitively obvious and that they understand.
Right.
I do not prefer the word AI out there,
Right.
yet every vendor has it in their booth. And I am on a single path right now to change the definition to actionable information. It's how the technology should be used between all the data
Absolutely.
out there. Who cares whether whether it's called AI artificial? But that word artificial is part of the problem,
Yeah.
right? And when we talk about robotics, the first thing that comes out of anybody's mouth is, "Oh, you're trying to reduce labor." I've been interviewed on this.
Right.
Absolutely.
Go look at the
Absolutely.
press that got recently in the last couple of weeks. There was some articles out there on some of the voice AI being used at drive-throughs, right? And how they're trying to control labor. And I'm sitting there going, no, they're just trying to get more drive-through in there. It's not necessarily controlling labor. And by the way, robotics doesn't necessarily mean we're trying to control labor. We may want to be more efficient. We may want to operate more hours. And we may want to operate smaller units.
Right.
Right.
I like your term. Actionable information, I think, is a good way to apply it. Within the technology realm, we are constantly battling the perception of what is being deployed as quote unquote technology versus how does it just show up as something that's more efficient and more effective in the way that you can either allow labor to do their job better, right? Or create an experience for the customer that's
Right.
just more seamless.
But yet
and
yet when people in the media want to talk about on a positive fashion, they want to know about some of the new innovation that occurs in our industry. In a negative fashion, labor is one of those areas that the first thing that people think is you want to try to cut labor. And I try to look at any technology that we're using, for instance, in labor or robotics, as an additional opportunity to provide better service.
Yeah.
Because the customers want more convenient service, right?
Absolutely.
And they want it where they want it. And that's where the tech's going to come in. And if you're an operator, it can't always be about cutting costs. It actually, if you reverse it, could be about increasing revenue.
The National Restaurant Association surveyed operators and asked them that question specifically. And basically 70% say they view it as augmentation, augmenting the workforce and not replacing it.
And I would agree with that.
Yeah.
That's what I see. But yet, it is a tight market. We see a lot of legislation. And I am not on the legislative side of this. So I just cover what happens in the ops, right? But I do see what's going on, and there have to be some halfway points, and technology seems to be a solution. And Kevin, to your point, I took a look at the directory for this show, and I think they maybe had 600, maybe 700 companies that actually identified themselves as technology. But in reality, when I do a count of the show, because I went through the whole list, I think there's closer to 12 to 1,400. It's just that some of the companies here don't identify themselves as technology.
Absolutely.
Yet my experience, even when I was on the board of the Restaurant Association, was that there wasn't a single thing that you did that didn't have technology behind it. The question is whether you put it in front or behind.
Absolutely, yeah. And we always talk about technology as an enabler. So as we think about, what's in the best interest of the business, so, labor, other types of expenses and other ways that you're serving your customers, technology plays a role, and it becomes an enabler to allow for those things to be effective for the purposes of your business. To Hudson's point, we're looking at technology within the restaurant space as an augmentation of labor. We have a massive gap in terms of open positions to the demand that restaurants have for labor. So at some point, you've got to determine how you can be most efficient, how you can enable the folks that you have when you may be short, 10 or 15 people in your operation. And technology is the way to do that.
And then, by the way, you have added on there the 6 generations that are both in the workforce and customers today, because I add in Gen Alpha in there as a customer. And when you're learning on a iPad at 3 years old, you are learning and picking, and they do food items, all kinds of things, right? So we have that labor force out there, which is generational. Plus, we also have the customer side of it. So you have to put all those types of things, together as additional challenges that we have. So let me just sort of wrap this up 2 ways. So Hudson, you do an awful lot of research, and I've probably underappreciated the complexity and the amount of data and things that you have to look at and how you slice and dice it, because everybody wants their own silo. So how do you hope that the research that you do is going to impact the industry in technology going forward, however you define that? The suppliers, the operators, how do you see that?
It all goes back to the old axiom that good business decisions are based on good data. And good data is very specifically defined. And that's why it ultimately, an accounting question about how much you invest in technology has to be very specific as to what's included and what's excluded. But in the end, people want to eat out. 90% of Americans enjoy going to restaurants. That is not changing. There's pent-up demand to use the industry. And so along with that growth comes more technology.
Right. So you have to have. So Kevin, you're going to get the last word here, because you are representing technology 2 ways. One for the association itself,
right,
which I'm sure has its challenges and opportunities in it, because you are a business. And by the way, you're a multifaceted business if you think about all the different areas that you got to cover, including the states, right? Because you've got to feed things there too. But if we look at the operations, where do you see your efforts and the association itself making a difference going forward for the operators of all sorts in 70 different categories and all around the world in tech? Where do you see your role, and what do you want to happen?
Yeah, I see it in 3 ways, I think. One of which is education, right? So, Hudson talked about the research that we do and making sure that people understand the themes of what's happening. You said it earlier, there's a lot of complexity in how to run a restaurant operation. So part of it is bringing education to bear. The second thing is bringing practitioners together. So, as I talked about earlier, as a CIO, I look for different venues to meet with other folks that are running technology operations. And so I want to learn from them. I want to be able to talk about my challenges and hear from them relative to how they're solving their problems. The third is, how do we bring some degree of solutions to the table? One of the things we're focused on right now is cybersecurity. And as we think about the point of influence relative to cyber, it's less the technologists, it's more the leaders of and owners of restaurants to understand the risk and the vulnerability, right? And so helping them to understand ways that they can educate themselves, ask the right questions of their vendors. We talked about that earlier. Asking the right questions of their technology leaders to make sure that they're focused on the right things to protect their business. We want to bring those types of resources to bear for our members and for the industry. So those are the three ways I think we can serve.
Very broad mandate, and certainly a very broad subject, and one that's just going to continue to grow. And it's really great to see the association, fostering that information, education, research to make it happen for both the supplier, the operator side, the supply chain, anybody that has anything to do with it. And, certainly, taking that message forward and providing that guidance. So very important role. I really appreciate both of you joining me here at the show.
Yeah, thank you.
And I have a feeling this could be the start of a number of conversations we could have, because it's a lot of fun anyway. And it's good to get together and do that. So thank you for joining us on Techbytes here at the National Restaurant Association show.
Thank you, Rob. Enjoy the show.
Thanks.
This podcast is brought to you by the International Food and Beverage Technology Association. The IFBTA is the industry's voice of technology within the food and beverage industries, providing thought leadership as your single impartial go-to resource. The IFBTA offers in-person and online communities to connect with your peers, the exchange, an all-encompassing global technology resource, and an industry-wide professional education and certification program. The bottom line is the IFBTA is your place to gather, learn, and share. So thank you for joining us on this episode of the Techbytes podcast, powered by the IFBTA. I'm Rob Grimes, your host, and I look forward to taking our next bite of technology together.